Let's discuss the Benjamin 392 as currently produced and what it's all about. This is an adult-sized air gun that is a multi-pump pneumatic, and the maximum pump count is supposed to be 8. That's where it's supposed to achieve its maximum power of 685 feet per second, which is just basically call it 700 feet per second, and that's with a 14.3 grain lead 22 caliber pellet, not one of the lightweight aluminum alloy pellets that the Springers are rated at. You know, these Springers you see that are rated at 1,000, 1,200, 1,400, whatever feet per second. Those are with super lightweight pellets that are not much good for hunting. This is rated with a 14.3 grain lead pellet, which is good for hunting. And of course that's 22 caliber, as I pointed out. And you know, you see people, if you look these things up on the air gun forums, you'll see some people putting them down, talking bad about them, talking about how, in fact, I've seen some people refer to them as junk. I saw one guy who claimed that it was no better quality than one of these, and that it should be selling for $35 or $40 maximum. That guy's an idiot. I'm sorry, but he's probably never handled either of these, or he's just lying through his teeth, one or the other. And he claimed that the 392 has a lot of plastic in it, and so on. Now, this is the Crossman 760 as currently made, and it's plastic. This is a $30 or $35 air gun. I don't even say air rifle because it's a smooth bore, which is fine for my use. I use it as a BB gun. I've never fired a pellet in it that I can recall. But this it's a wood stock. It is, as Benjamins have always been, it has a brass air tube and a brass barrel that's soldered to the air tube. And let's see, it has a brass front sight. You can see there's a little chip out of the paint on that, and you can see that it's brass. It's not plastic, as some have claimed. It has the front cap is, I believe it's aluminum. It might be brass, I don't remember for sure, but I think it's aluminum. The trigger housing is metal. It's a zinc alloy. I don't remember right offhand what that's called, but it's, I mean, Sheridans have been made with zinc alloys for a long time. And the rear plug here is part of the trigger housing. Now this wood is not walnut, but you'll be hard put to find even a firearm that has a walnut stock anymore. This air rifle is, right now on Amazon you can buy one for $140 in free shipping. And I'll provide a link in the video description to buy one of those. I would appreciate you using my link if you decide you want one, because that helps me out, supports the channel. But the trigger is steel. The components inside the trigger mechanism are steel. There is some plastic on this gun. The buttstock. Everything else is wood and metal. Well, the safety might be plastic, I'm not sure. But anyway, so you hear people talking about how the earlier Benjamins are so much better. Well, this is a 1968 Benjamin 342. And you know, it's made pretty much the same way. Steel bolt, brass breech and barrel, and brass air tube, and so on. And it does have a walnut stock, but back then, you know, walnut was a lot cheaper, and walnut stocks were common. But all the trigger parts and so on are stamped steel. That was cheap construction. That was what constituted cheap construction back then. Because not many things were made with cast metal. That just wasn't it wasn't so popular yet. But if you look at the safety here, it's stamped steel. Back then, that was considered cheap construction. Now another thing, this is much smaller. Benjamins back in the day, as they say, were much smaller. They were intended for basically kids. Early teens throughout the teen years, basically, is what these guns were intended for. And that doesn't mean an adult couldn't use them, but they're pretty small. Also, the power was less. And Tim McMurray of Mach 1 Airguns is the most renowned expert on Sheridan air rifles. And Tim produces what's called the Steroid Package, where he takes a Sheridan or some Benjamins and works it over for greater power and more longevity to make it last a lifetime, which they pretty much do anyway, you know. But what he did was he made it stronger so that it could handle up to 14 pumps when you need the additional power, or when you feel you need the additional power, and still last a lifetime. You know, if you did what Benjamin and Sheridan intended, which was shoot it most of the time with 4 or 5 pumps, and pump it up to 8 pumps or so when you need the additional power for hunting. If you do that, it will last a lifetime. And that's why, you know, you see stuff like this, and even the earlier 312, which was first produced in the 50s, and you still see those guns around even now, and being used. But as I mentioned, this is quite a bit larger, and the reason it is because this really, for all intents and purposes, this is a Sheridan. This is a 22 caliber Sheridan, because Sheridans are 20 caliber, and 20 caliber is great, but the pellets are not as readily available as 22, and there's not as wide of a selection of pellets available. 15 grains is about the maximum weight you could get in a 20 caliber. You can get over 30 grains in a 22 caliber if you need it for, you know, hunting something larger or whatever. And these things, make no mistake, they have enough power to hunt animals up to raccoon size in just normal hunting, or even maybe like a javelina. And in a true survival situation, especially with a heavier pellet, you could actually bag a small deer or a small hog or whatever if you needed to. You know, the rifle has enough power to do it at short range. It's just up to your skill in using it. Now, I'm not recommending that you do that. I don't know of any state where it's legal to do so. But in a survival situation, I believe it could be done. And like I said, something up to coon size, it has no problem killing. So, but like I said, this is really a Sheridan. And again, defaulting back to Tim McMurray, he said that starting in 77 or 78, that the Benjamins, which was the 342, was the 22 caliber pumper that Benjamin produced at that time. And starting in 77 or 78, it got a Sheridan valve, and at that point it was it's a suitable candidate for steroid treatment. Earlier Benjamins are not, because their valves are not capable of the performance. And at this point, let's discuss the history a little bit, just so we know what we're coming from. Before 1977, Benjamin and Sheridan were separate companies. Benjamin, of course, was aware of Sheridan and, liked their technology. Basically, the Sheridan was a higher performance and adult-sized version of Benjamin technology, pretty much. And so in 1977, though, Sheridan was about to go out of business because they weren't selling enough, I guess. And Benjamin saved them, bought them out in 1977. And so at that point, Benjamin was in St. Louis. Sheridan was in Racine, Wisconsin. And Benjamin pretty much left the company alone and allowed Sheridan to continue producing, their guns in Racine. But what they did do was copied some of the technology that the Sheridans were using and applied it to their 342 and 347, which was the 177 caliber version. And at that point, it becomes truly an adult air rifle. And pretty close, or at least approaching what the Sheridan was, but in the more common calibers of 177 and 22. Now 177 is, to me, 177 is not the best caliber for hunting. And so I'll confine my discussion to 22s. Okay, in 1986, Benjamin moves production of their air rifles from St. Louis to Racine, to the Sheridan plant. In 1991, and here's where a lot of the people complain about, the 392s and all the Benjamins and so on that are produced by Crossman. In 1991, Crossman acquires Benjamin and thereby Sheridan as well. Now from 1991, Crossman pretty much left them alone. Left the Benjamin and Sheridan alone to continue what they were doing. Except they introduced the 392. Now at that time, the 392, when they came out with it, it was a copy of the Sheridan. It was basically a 22 caliber Sheridan. And I want to show you a Sheridan Blue Streak. Okay, this is a 1977 model Sheridan Blue Streak, 20 caliber. Now it's exactly the same size as this 392. It has the rocker safety. The 392 has, the crossbolt safety, different trigger arrangement. But at that time the 392 did not. The 392 had, it still utilized the same safety as the 342. It still had the same valve that the late 342s have, which is the same valve that a Sheridan has. It has the same size stock and everything as the Sheridan Blue Streak and Silver Streak, which is just a nickel-plated version of the same gun. Had the same trigger arrangement except for a different safety. Okay, now at 1977, which was the last year that Sheridan was on their own and was not owned by Benjamin. I want you to take a look at this. It is not drilled and tapped for the peep sight, and the peep sight is a very good thing. Alright, now here is a later, this is actually a late 80s, post 1986. So Benjamin owned it, but Crossman didn't own it yet. Now this is, it still says Sheridan Products, Racine, Wisconsin. It was still produced there. But this is about an 87, I believe, Blue Streak. Sheridan Blue Streak. And you see it still has the rocker safety. It's still made the same way. But it's actually drilled and tapped for the peep sight, which this one actually has the Williams peep sight. And I tell you, that's a wonderful thing. But, so at the time that this was made, the Benjamin 392 was the same gun. It had the same valve. It did not have the rocker safety. But for the most part, it was the same gun, only in .22 caliber. So it had the benefits that you get from .22 caliber pellets. But it had all the positive attributes of the Sheridan Blue Streak. Now, in 1995, which was 4 years after Crossman acquired Benjamin and Sheridan, they made a couple of changes. They went to this style trigger, and most importantly, they went to a cartridge valve. Now, the cartridge valve is capable of at least as much performance as the Sheridan valve. And by the way, the Sheridans went to that kind of valve too. The C9 Sheridans are, let's see, I think they might have called it something, they might have modified the name a little bit, because I think the C9, they started calling it the C9 in '91 when they first acquired it, when it was still a rocker safety. I'm not sure though. I'm not 100% clear on that point. But the bottom line is they continue to produce the blue and silver streaks, but they went to this style of safety. I mean, this style of trigger and safety, and they went to the cartridge valve, and that is capable of as much, if not more, performance than the earlier Sheridan valve, with the advantage of it's much easier to take it out, work on it, because the whole thing comes out easily, as opposed to the earlier Benjamins and Sheridans, including the earlier Benjamins that did not use the Sheridan style valve. The valve body was soldered into the tube and was not removable. So you had to have a special tool to remove the guts of the valve and work on it, and put it back in place and everything, and hope that you didn't cross thread it on the way in. And because if you did, you pretty much ruined the gun. And the same was true of the Sheridans. So when Crossman came out with this cartridge valve, that made it much easier to work on. Also, you can replace the cartridge valve entirely if you just completely destroy it, trying to modify it. You can replace it for about, I think Crossman charges about $20 for a brand new one. And just pop the new one in place and you're good to go again. By that same token, you can also buy a spare valve. Okay, while we're here, I'm going to demonstrate how simple these are to work on. And one of the things that I don't like about these compared to the older rocker safety Sheridans is with the Sheridan, it's always a good idea with any pumper, any of the striker fired valve type pumpers, which are, you know, the best design in my opinion. Both Crossman and Daisy have made the other type where the valve is held closed until you trip it, and then it opens and dumps everything. With this, you've got a hammer that hits a poppet valve, and that's a better design in my opinion. So one thing about it though is, with any of that design, it's a good idea to cock it before you pump it. That way you're removing the tension of the hammer spring, the hammer and the hammer spring, from the poppet valve, which might hold it cracked open just a little bit, depending on how strong the valve spring, the poppet valve spring is. So I get around that potential air leak by caulking it before I pump it. And what I like to do is go ahead and put a pellet in it then, once I have it pumped up. And you're supposed to leave these pumped up a little bit. And at least a couple of pumps, because otherwise the valve will start leaking, because it'll get dirt in it. But as long as you keep at least a couple of pumps in it, it holds the poppet valve closed and nothing can get in there. And so that holds your seal. But like with the, let's see, let's grab this one. See, this has got, that's got air pressure in it. And it was not cocked, see. So what I do is I'll put a pellet in, I cock it, pump it, then put a pellet in it, and then with the safety off and holding the bolt, I pull the trigger and ease it forward, let it go forward under the spring pressure, which relieves the pressure from the spring, and it won't fire at that point. It's safe. You have to work the bolt. You got to pull the bolt back to cock it to make it so that it'll fire again. But if you look at this bolt compared to the late 392 bolt, and the same is true of the late Crossman produced Sheridan Blue Streak. You see there's a flat milled into, let's see, am I covering it? There it is. Yeah, there's a flat milled into the bolt, and that's a safety feature that holds the bolt closed. And that reminds me, by the way, when I was talking about the early Benjamins and these later ones being more of a Sheridan actually than a Benjamin, if you look at the cam plate right here, look at that cam plate, see it's bent over at the end, and it engages that screw that closes and holds closed the bolt, holds it closed under pressure. It cams it closed just like a bolt action cartridge rifle. Or, you know, of course a bolt action cartridge rifle is going to have a heavier lug than that, but in an air rifle that little grub screw is enough. And if you look at a Sheridan, it has the same basic design, but the cam plate completely covers that hole. And so it's slightly different. Same basic design, but a little bit different. Same thing with the later Sheridan. Now, look at the 392. Which one does it look like? Looks like the Sheridan. Basically, after Benjamin bought Sheridan, you can't say they stole the designs, because you know, they owned it now. And unless I'm mistaken, Sheridan pretty much took Benjamin's designs and improved on them, you know, when they built their guns. But Benjamin then used the improvements that Sheridan had come up with once they owned it. So anyway, that's enough about that. But back to this. The deal is, with this cutout in the bolt, there's a thing from the trigger that comes up in here, and the trigger cannot be pulled unless the bolt is closed. Okay? Open, close. Alright. And that kind of, it theoretically holds the bolt closed when you pull the trigger, but if you've got this adjusted correctly, that holds the bolt closed anyway. And for, you know, all previous Benjamins and Sheridans, this was all that was needed. So, for some reason though, Crossman felt that they needed to make an interlock, safety interlock there, so you could not pull the trigger as long as the bolt's open. And so the problem with that is, if you cock it, you know, you cock it, pump it, put a pellet in it, and now it's cocked. You can't decock it because you can't pull the trigger and ride it forward. It doesn't work. So I'm going to fix that. But I'm first going to show you how simple it is to take this thing apart. One of these cheap 4-way screwdrivers is all you need, because these are not really precision screws. So the first thing you do is, with the bolt closed, and I pulled the trigger and decocked it. Now I checked before I started any of this video and depressurized it, made sure there was no pellet in the chamber and everything, so you know, I know this thing is not loaded. Okay, so you take the stock screw out. And you make sure it's off safe. Go ahead and open the pump handle just a little bit and leave it open. And pull the stock off. Next thing is you take these two screws out. There's one on each side. Still with the bolt closed. Now what you're going to want to do is put a finger through the trigger guard and hold a little bit of pressure on it, because it's under just a little bit of spring pressure from the hammer spring. So you take that screw out, and still holding a little pressure on it, flip it over and take the other one out. Now you just slide it backwards. The complete trigger assembly comes out, and there's the hammer spring. We're going to leave the hammer in right now and take the screwdriver and just, with the pump handle open, push forward a little. And what that does is make sure the valve is, it takes pressure off the threads of this bolt here, and then you take a 7/16 wrench and remove that carefully. I say carefully because you want to make sure that there's not still pressure on it so that you don't strip the threads. Okay, that comes out, and you can dump the hammer out. That's what it looks like. And then, let me grab a shop rag for the valve to fall on. And you can just, now with the bolt remaining closed, you can just give it a pump. Or 2 or 3. So there it comes. It's a little more difficult to get the valve out because of previous modifications I did, including adding a second O-ring right there to improve the efficiency. But I've got it out now. And I mean, it just pops out, but you might need to add a little bit of persuasion. Now, one thing I am going to do is, I noticed, and I covered this in the previous video, where I did the 2-spring modification on the internals, on the inside of the valve, which increases efficiency and makes it easier to pump. And I did not shorten the factory spring. I reused the factory poppet spring and did not shorten it. And that made it act kind of like an air conserving pumper. But eventually the spring took a set and it started acting less like an air conserving pumper and more like, you know, just normal. And what I'm going to do now is go ahead and shorten that spring, or maybe even replace it with a lighter one. But that's the poppet spring, and here's the poppet valve, and I'll clean that. But now of note is that Crossman did, for a little while, when they first went to the cartridge valve, they started using an aluminum valve, and that was a bad thing. And there were some problems with that. So they relented and went back to the brass valve. So now you have the advantages of brass and the advantages of the cartridge style valve, and the ability, you know, to have extra spare valves. So that's one of the reasons that, in my opinion, this is a better survival gun than the older Sheridans and the older 392P. This is the 392PA. The cartridge version is called the PA. So the first generation 392, where it still had the soldered in valve, was called the 392P, and it did not have a cartridge valve. This is a better arrangement, in my estimation. Okay, so I'm going to put a lighter spring in that. That's a pretty heavy spring, and that's one of the typical modifications that you do to a either a pumper or a CO2, especially a CO2. I learned this from working on CO2 guns, is you go with a lighter poppet valve, and just enough to ensure that the poppet valve closes. And that's where I first learned about cocking the thing before pumping it, because Tim McMurray, again, one of the things he does is puts a lighter spring in it. And sometimes it won't seal with that lighter spring with the pressure of the hammer and hammer spring on it. So you got to cock it to take that pressure off the poppet before you can pump it. So that being one of the steroid modifications, and also one of the modifications that, as I said, I learned when working on CO2 guns, I'm going to use a lighter spring, and that will allow me to dump more pumps. And it did get to where I could fully dump 5 pumps and mostly dump 8 pumps. So it was turning into no longer an air conserving pumper. And I decided I didn't really like the air conserving feature anyway, so I'm going to go back to being able to dump 12 pumps or so, and hopefully I'll be able to get higher velocity out of, with more pumps for if and when I need the extra power. Because yesterday I was shooting it with the 18.1 grain JSB heavy pellets, which is a great pellet, by the way. And I got, at 8 pumps, 637 feet per second. I would like to push it over 700 feet per second with the 18.1 grain. And it will do over 700 feet per second with the 14.3 grain Crossman pellets. But I'd like to do that with the heavier pellets.